Have you ever believed something so deeply that it felt unquestionable, until one moment shattered that illusion completely? That was how it began for Professor Steven Pinker, one of Harvard's most respected minds in linguistics and psychology. A man whose words shaped how the world thought about language itself. For decades, he had spoken about English as not just a language, but a system of thought, a mirror of intelligence. Yet, somewhere between his data and his definitions, a quiet prejudice had taken root. One he never realized was there, until it was challenged by a single, gentle voice from halfway across the world. He once said it casually in an interview that millions would later replay online. "Filipinos," he remarked, "speak a kind of English, but not real English. It's more of a local adaptation." The comment was not meant to insult, but the words carried weight far beyond intention. In classrooms, in call centers, in homes across Manila and Cebu, people heard it and felt something crack inside. A subtle ache. Because for many Filipinos, English was not merely a skill. It was a bridge, a tool for survival, a voice that had connected them to the wider world. And to hear one of the world's top language scholars dismiss it as not real felt like being told that their voices did not count. It was whispered afterward, in academic circles, that even Harvard believed Filipinos spoke a lesser English, as if the world had silently agreed on it long ago. They imitate, some said. They memorize. They don't think in English. The illusion spread easily, because no one had ever challenged it. Not until a student named Maria quietly raised her hand in one of Pinker's lectures. She was a graduate student from the University of the Philippines, on a full scholarship at Harvard. She spoke English with clarity, poise, and a musical rhythm that drew attention every time she read aloud. But that day, when Pinker discussed how certain regions borrow and simplify English, Maria asked a question that froze the entire lecture hall. "Sir," she said softly, "if English is a living language, can it ever be less real in the mouths of people who live with it every day?" The room fell silent. It was not a challenge. It was curiosity, innocence wrapped in truth. Pinker paused, then smiled politely, offering an academic answer about structure and syntax. But something about her tone lingered. After class, he found himself replaying her words in his mind. Less real. What did that even mean? Days turned into weeks, but the phrase followed him, like a quiet echo beneath his lectures. He began noticing things he had overlooked before. Filipino students in his seminars wrote essays filled with warmth, empathy, and fluid metaphors that his American students rarely attempted. In discussions, they listened deeply before speaking, as if their words carried a moral weight. Their English wasn't mechanical. It breathed. It carried emotion, humility, and faith. Then, one afternoon, while reviewing linguistic field data, he came across a paper written by a group of Filipino educators. It wasn't published in any major Western journal, but its analysis of bilingual cognition was brilliant. Clear, deeply human, and insightful. He read it twice, and then again. There was something in it that felt alive, something that Western linguistic models often sterilized in their obsession with correctness. But habits die hard. In the following weeks, Pinker still defended his claim when asked by colleagues. "It's not about intelligence," he would insist. "It's about fidelity to the source language. English in the Philippines simply diverged too much." Yet every time he spoke those words, he felt less certain. He began noticing contradictions everywhere. Filipino nurses comforting patients in flawless English, diplomats articulating compassion with perfect cadence, call center agents adapting accents so naturally that American customers thought they were locals. Still, his mind resisted what his heart had begun to feel. Until one afternoon, he received an invitation from the Ateneo de Manila University to speak at a regional conference on language, thought, and humanity. The email was polite, humble, and unexpectedly sincere. He almost declined. But Maria, his Filipino student, approached him after class, eyes bright with quiet conviction. "Professor," she said, "you always said language reveals how humans think. Come see how Filipinos think. Come hear how we speak, not from grammar but from the heart." Her words landed softly, yet they carried the weight of something he could not define. A challenge, maybe, or a promise. Pinker hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right, Maria," he replied. "Let's see this English of yours." And so, for the first time in decades, Harvard's famed linguist packed his notes and left the ancient halls of Cambridge for the humid air of Manila. He had no idea that what awaited him there would not only rewrite his understanding of English, but redefine his faith in humanity itself. When the plane descended through the heavy clouds above Manila, Steven Pinker pressed his forehead lightly against the window. The view below was a chaotic mosaic of tin roofs, glittering high-rises, and green veins of palm trees stretching into the horizon. It was unlike anything he had imagined. For a man who had spent his life in the quiet precision of Harvard's libraries, the sight of Manila's restless life felt almost overwhelming, raw, pulsing, alive. Yet beneath that curiosity was a silent arrogance he couldn't quite shake. He still believed he was coming to teach, not to learn. He was greeted at the airport by a group of students from Ateneo, all smiles and warm voices. They carried small banners that read, "Welcome, Professor Pinker." One of them, a young man named Raphael, introduced himself as the student coordinator. "We've been reading your book, The Language Instinct, since high school," he said with sincere admiration. Pinker smiled politely. Compliments were familiar to him. But there was something about the boy's tone, humble yet intelligent, that made him pause. During the ride to the university, the traffic was suffocating. Jeepneys packed with people lined the streets, vendors sold rosaries beside fruit stands, and a taxi driver softly hummed an old Beatles tune while maneuvering through the chaos. Raphael, sitting beside him, spoke English effortlessly, blending American idioms with Filipino warmth. "Manila can be messy, sir," he said with a grin, "but she teaches patience." Pinker chuckled. It was a charming line, but there was something in the way he said she teaches patience that felt poetic, almost reverent. It reminded him that in English, Filipinos didn't just communicate, they connected. At the Ateneo campus, the air was heavy with humidity and the faint scent of rain. Students hurried between old stone buildings, laughter echoing under archways. The next day, Pinker was scheduled to deliver his lecture on the evolution of language and human thought. The audience was larger than expected. Professors, priests, linguists, and hundreds of students crowded the auditorium. On stage, banners displayed words he found curious. Language as faith, faith as language. He began with confidence, discussing the history of English, its migration through colonies and cultures. His tone was clinical, detached, until, midway, he mentioned linguistic purity. "In academic linguistics," he said, "we often regard variations as deviations from the original form." He didn't notice the subtle stir in the crowd until a soft voice from the second row interrupted him. "Sir," it was a middle-aged woman, a literature professor. "Wouldn't that make every human expression a deviation? Even Shakespeare changed his English. Are we not all part of its evolution?" Her question was calm, respectful, but it carried weight. Pinker froze for a moment. The audience watched him carefully. For the first time, he found himself struggling for a perfect answer. "Yes," he finally said, "but structure matters. Language needs consistency." The woman smiled gently. So does faith, Professor. But even faith adapts to survive. The room erupted in quiet applause. After the session, he lingered in the courtyard, unsettled. The Filipinos he met spoke English with a rhythm unlike anywhere else, musical yet exact, tender yet confident. A Jesuit priest approached him and offered a bottle of water. "You spoke well," the priest said kindly, "but perhaps you spoke to the mind, not the soul." Pinker smiled awkwardly. "I'm a scientist, Father." The priest nodded. "Ah, but language is older than science. Maybe that's why Filipinos still pray in English, not because it's foreign, but because it makes them feel heard." That night, back in his hotel room overlooking the city, Pinker couldn't sleep. He watched the streets below, vendors packing up their stalls, children laughing near the church, a woman humming while sweeping her doorstep. He realized something quietly profound. In Manila, even the noise had syntax. There was order in the chaos, meaning in the mundane. Over the next few days, he joined campus tours, visiting classrooms where teachers switched between English, Tagalog, and Visayan without hesitation. He watched a young woman teach literature in English so fluidly that her students responded in harmony, quoting Frost, then slipping into a Tagalog proverb that somehow carried the same truth. It wasn't broken English, it was woven English, and every word seemed soaked with culture, humility, and faith. One afternoon, Raphael invited him to a small community school in Quezon City, where volunteer teachers helped underprivileged kids learn English through stories. The building was modest, walls painted with fading murals. A group of children sat on the floor, listening as a young teacher read The Little Prince. Her accent was distinctly Filipino, her words soft and lilting. Yet when she said, "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly," Pinker felt something stir inside him. For the first time, he wasn't analyzing her pronunciation. He was feeling her words. After class, the teacher introduced herself as Liza. "We teach English," she said shyly, "but what we really teach is hope. English gives these kids a chance to dream beyond these walls." Pinker looked around, the cracked floors, the laughter, the cross hanging above the blackboard, and something inside him shifted. Maybe this wasn't about grammar or accent at all. Maybe this was about humanity finding a voice. That night, as the rain poured outside his window, he finally admitted to himself, quietly, almost fearfully, that his old certainty was crumbling. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps real English wasn't defined by origin or purity, but by purpose and heart. And in that moment, as thunder rolled over Manila's skyline, he knew he hadn't come to teach. He had come to listen. The next morning, the air in Manila was thick with humidity, and the faint scent of roasted coffee drifting from a nearby stall. Stephen Pinker sat quietly in the back of a van as it wound through narrow streets, past churches filled with morning worshippers and markets bursting with life. It was his third day in the Philippines, yet it already felt as if time had slowed. He had begun to see things differently. Shadows of humility in the chaos, rhythms of kindness in the noise. He was on his way to give a guest lecture at the University of the Philippines in Diliman, where hundreds of students and faculty had gathered to hear him speak. As the van pulled up to the campus, he was greeted by a sea of faces, students smiling, waving small flags, their energy unfiltered, genuine. "Welcome, Professor Pinker," one shouted. "We love your books," another yelled. "Thank you for coming to the Philippines." He waved shyly, not used to being welcomed with such warmth. It wasn't the formal applause of Western academia. It was affection. Pure, unguarded, human. Inside the auditorium, the chatter was alive, full of laughter. Pinker stood at the podium, his notes trembling slightly in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt nervous. Not because he doubted his material, but because he felt the weight of something he couldn't define. When he began to speak, the students listened intently, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions open and kind. He talked about how language shaped thought, how words framed perception. Then, from somewhere in the audience, a young man raised his hand. "Professor," he said, "you once said English gives people power. But don't you think the Filipinos have given English something too? Maybe warmth, maybe soul." The room fell quiet. Pinker looked at the student, speechless for a second. The question was simple, but it carried a depth that pierced through years of theory. "Perhaps," he said softly. "Perhaps you're right." After the lecture, the university hosted a small lunch in his honor. He sat with professors of linguistics, literature, and theology, men and women whose eyes glowed with purpose. They spoke about how English in the Philippines had evolved into a bridge of compassion, how it was used to comfort, to teach, to heal. One professor said, "Our English isn't borrowed, it's baptized." The others nodded in agreement, smiling. Pinker paused, letting the phrase sink in. Baptized English. He had never heard language described with such reverence. Later that afternoon, they took him on a tour of Intramuros, the old walled city of Manila. The sun was dipping low, turning the sky gold. As they walked past centuries-old churches and cobblestone paths, he listened to his guide, an elderly man named Father Ignacio, tell stories about faith surviving conquest, war, and disaster. "Language and faith," the priest said, "they survive the same way, by belonging to the people who love them." Pinker nodded slowly. There was wisdom in that sentence, an understanding that language wasn't about ownership, but belonging. As evening approached, Father Ignacio invited him into San Agustin Church. Inside, the air was cool and silent, candles flickering along the marble walls. A small choir was rehearsing at the altar, their voices blending English hymns with Tagalog verses. The melody rose softly, fragile yet powerful. Pinker closed his eyes and listened. He didn't understand every word, but the emotion transcended comprehension. The English was accented, imperfect, yet more sincere than anything he'd heard in years. It was English not spoken to impress, but to pray. After the rehearsal, one of the singers, a young woman, approached him shyly. "Professor Pinker," she said, "I read your books. You said language helps people think better. Maybe that's why we sing in English. It helps us believe better." He smiled, humbled. "You may be right," he whispered. The next morning, he visited a small hospital in Makati, where he was told many Filipino nurses had studied English specifically to comfort their patients. Inside, he watched as a nurse gently spoke to an elderly American man recovering from surgery. "You're strong, sir," she said softly. "You're not alone." Her English was calm, intimate, full of empathy, the man's eyes filled with tears. Pinker stood quietly by the doorway, realizing that this simple act of kindness was language at its highest form. Not grammar, not structure, connection. As he left the hospital, the nurse turned to him. "Sir," she said with a shy smile, "I heard your lecture yesterday. You said English is power, but I think power is how we use it, to care, not to dominate." That night he sat on the hotel balcony, looking out at the city lights shimmering over the bay. For years, he had studied English as a symbol of civilization, as the tool of logic and science. But here, in this country he once underestimated, he found that English had become something else entirely: human, warm, spiritual. It wasn't the English of empire or academia. It was the English of the heart. He closed his notebook and leaned back, the humid air brushing against his face. For the first time in decades, Steven Pinker felt something that theory could never explain. Not just admiration, but awe. Somewhere below, church bells rang softly, and the city murmured in 1,000 accents. And for the first time, he truly listened. Not as a linguist, not as a scholar, but as a man learning the language of the soul. The following week felt like a lifetime unfolding in slow motion. Steven Pinker stayed longer than he had planned, though he didn't say it aloud. The Manila air, heavy with rain and exhaust, had begun to feel familiar. The kind of familiarity that seeps into you quietly until you realize it's changed something inside. He no longer saw the country as a backdrop to study, but as a living text, its people, its faith, its laughter all stitched into one vast language that had nothing to do with grammar and everything to do with grace. Each morning, he walked through the Ateneo campus without his entourage, his notebook tucked under his arm. Students greeted him not with fear or formality, but with warmth. "Good morning, sir." "Did you have breakfast, Professor?" It startled him at first, that kind of gentleness. In the West, intellectual circles often built walls of ego. Here, knowledge was shared like bread, freely, humbly, and with joy. He started joining them at the cafeteria, sharing coffee and pandesal, listening more than he spoke. One afternoon, he attended a small workshop for teachers from rural provinces. The topic was teaching English through empathy. The room was simple, no air conditioning, just electric fans humming. But the energy was alive. One teacher from Mindanao stood up and said, "We teach our children to speak English, but we tell them never to lose their kindness. English helps them reach the world, but kindness keeps them human." The whole room nodded. Pinker wrote it down, underlining the words twice. Later, Maria, the student who had once challenged him at Harvard, joined him for dinner. They sat under the soft lights of a street cafe, the smell of grilled fish and rain mingling in the air. She told him about growing up in Davao, where English was a second language, yet somehow felt natural, woven into prayer, family, and everyday life. "It's not about sounding American," she said. "It's about being understood. When we speak English, we don't copy, we connect." He looked at her, seeing not a student anymore, but a teacher. "Do you ever feel," he asked, "that people like me, people from the West, don't really see that?" Maria smiled faintly. "Maybe not yet," she said, "but you're here now. That means something." The next day, Pinker was invited to visit a fishing village in Batangas, where a local NGO taught children English through storytelling. The drive took hours, winding through green hills and small towns. When they arrived, the sea stretched endlessly before him, calm and silver under the afternoon sun. Dozens of children sat on the sand, their eyes wide as a volunteer read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The kids laughed and repeated the English phrases, their voices echoing against the waves. When the story ended, one boy asked him shyly, "Sir, do you know stories too?" Pinker hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, he knelt down and began to tell them an old fable from his childhood. His accent sounded strange to him now, too sharp, too deliberate. But the children listened, smiling, leaning closer. When he finished, a little girl said softly, "That's beautiful, sir. You talk like in the movies." He laughed, embarrassed but touched. For the first time, his English, the English of Harvard, felt small compared to theirs. That night, as the waves whispered outside his hut, he wrote in his journal, "In the Philippines, English doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to the kind." A few days later, he attended Sunday Mass in Cebu. The church overflowed with people, families, workers, students, all singing in English, their voices trembling with devotion. The choir's hymn rose like sunlight through stained glass. "Amazing Grace," they sang, with accents that made every word sound tender, almost fragile. Pinker felt his throat tighten. He looked around, the old woman clutching her rosary, the young man kneeling with his child beside him, and suddenly he understood. This wasn't just religion. This was language transformed into faith. After the Mass, he spoke briefly with the parish priest. "Father," he said, "I used to believe English was a science. Now I think it's a prayer." The priest smiled knowingly. "Ah, Professor," he said, "prayer is the oldest language we all share. Maybe that's why your English sounds different here. It's not yours anymore. It's ours." That evening, Pinker returned to Manila, quiet and reflective. The city lights glimmered like constellations reflected on wet pavement. He thought about his career, the lectures, the books, the theories. For years, he had dissected language to find its logic, its structure. But here, in this archipelago of 1,000 voices, he found what logic could never explain: that the heart, not the brain, is the true author of speech. He thought of Maria's question back at Harvard. Can a language ever be less real in the mouths of those who live with it every day? He finally had his answer. No. In fact, it was more real here than anywhere he'd ever been. As the night deepened, he closed his notebook and whispered to himself, "Maybe I didn't come to teach English. Maybe English brought me here to learn." The city hummed below him, a living symphony of accents and faith, laughter and resilience. For the first time in his long, analytical life, Steven Pinker stopped trying to understand and began, simply, to feel. When Steven Pinker returned to Harvard, winter had already begun to frost the trees outside his office window. The air was sharp and silent, and the familiar stone corridors of the university felt colder than he remembered. The walls, once symbols of knowledge and prestige, now seemed distant, almost sterile, after the warmth of Manila. His desk was piled with letters, invitations, and drafts of lectures he no longer had the heart to deliver. For the first time in decades, the great professor found himself staring not at data, but at memories. He could still hear the voices of those children in Batangas repeating English words to the rhythm of the sea. He could still see the choir in Cebu, their eyes closed as they sang hymns with faith so pure it transcended accent, syntax, and structure. He could still feel the way Maria had looked at him that last evening, saying softly, "You don't need to sound Filipino to understand us, Professor. You just need to listen." For weeks, he avoided interviews and conferences. He spent his days reading through his old writings, and for the first time, he noticed something missing in them: a heartbeat. His theories were flawless, his arguments elegant, but they lacked humanity. He had always written about how language works, but never why people speak. The Philippines had given him the answer he never looked for. People speak not to display intelligence, but to share the soul. One afternoon, he was invited to give a commencement address at Harvard. He almost declined, still feeling unready to speak, but then he thought of those Filipino students waiting for their next lesson. Of Rafael and Maria, of the teachers who saw English as a vessel of hope. He knew he had to say something, not to defend his old beliefs, but to honor what he had learned. The auditorium was full. Cameras rolled. Rows of graduates, their gowns gleaming, waited for wisdom from one of the most quoted linguists of the century. He began quietly. "When I first studied language," he said, "I thought of it as an invention, a system built by the brain to express thought. But I've come to understand something deeper." He paused, scanning the crowd. Last year I visited the Philippines. I went there thinking I would teach about language. Instead, I was taught about humanity. I once said that Filipinos spoke a kind of English, but not real English. I was wrong." The room fell still. He continued, voice steady but soft. "In Manila, I saw English spoken by children who had never owned a single book, but whose every sentence carried hope. I heard nurses comfort dying patients in English, using words that healed more than medicine. I listened to prayers sung in English by people who believed not in grammar, but in grace. And I realized that the purity of a language is not measured by its origin, but by its intention." The audience leaned forward. He set his notes aside. "If there is such a thing as real English," he said, "then it is not the one spoken in London or New York or even here at Harvard. It is the English that bridges hearts. It is the English that forgives, that prays, that comforts. And in that sense, the Filipinos speak the truest English I have ever heard." A silence followed, long, reverent, and heavy with emotion. Then, slowly, the hall erupted into applause. Some stood, others wiped their eyes. It wasn't the usual applause for academic brilliance. It was the sound of people moved, not by intellect, but by humility. After the ceremony, a young Filipino scholar approached him, trembling slightly. "Professor," she said, "thank you for saying that. My parents watched that interview years ago when you said we didn't speak real English. It hurt them. Today, you healed that." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Your country healed me first," he replied. In the following months, Pinker began revising one of his manuscripts. Its new title read, "Language and the Heart: What the Philippines Taught Me About Humanity." In its opening lines, he wrote, "Language isn't born from intellect. It's born from empathy. And perhaps the greatest lesson I have learned is that a nation's voice is measured not by its accent, but by its compassion." His colleagues noticed a change in him. The once sharp-tongued intellectual now listened more than he spoke. In lectures, he quoted Filipino poets and educators, telling students that the world's understanding of English was incomplete without acknowledging the voices of the islands that carried it with such grace. "In the Philippines," he often said, "words kneel before meaning. That is what makes their English sacred." Years later, during a televised interview, he was asked if he still believed there was such a thing as real English. He smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. "Yes," he said, "but it's not what I thought it was. Real English is spoken wherever love is louder than pride." He looked down for a moment, then added quietly, "And I learned that lesson not from books, but from a country of islands and hearts called the Philippines." Outside, snow was falling over Harvard Yard, soft and silent. Inside, Steven Pinker sat back in his chair, eyes distant but peaceful. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still hear the faint melody of that Filipino choir in Cebu, their voices rising with faith and warmth, carrying an English that was no longer foreign, but eternal. And for the rest of his life, whenever he spoke, he made sure every word carried what he had discovered in that small, bright archipelago at the edge of the Pacific. Not just the sound of English, but the soul of it,